Welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, October 18th, 2024, and today we are going to be taking a look at the 2024 Electoral College map based on polling data and discussing what the map would look like if the polling inaccuracies were replicated of that in the 2020 presidential election. Now, I made a video about 2-3 weeks ago talking about the 2022 midterms and what the map would look like assuming that polling error was standard in this cycle. And I got some very reasonable requests from many of you guys. Some of you guys reached out personally, and I appreciate that because you looked at and wanted a 2020 electoral map comparison using that 2020 election error. And so what I decided to do here was do exactly that. I thought it'd be really great to take a look, just at some data points for the 2020 cycle and just comparing them to 2024, looking at states like Virginia and Michigan and Ohio, and looking at the error there, that we saw for Joe Biden, Donald Trump, what it said, who was overestimated, who was underestimated, and apply that to the numbers we have today. Now, on the national map, what we know is that Joe Biden was in a much better position 4 years ago today than Kamala Harris is against Donald Trump in this rematch. She leads by 2.3%. Joe Biden led on election day by 8.4%. And again, at this point in time, 4 years ago, Joe Biden led by 10.6%. So a massive, massive difference. And what you're going to find is that this electoral map is not going to be friendly to Vice President Harris. We know in the 2020 election, the polls weren't great. And while that may be, quote, pretty normal, according to Nate Silver, this was an article written back right in the aftermath of the 2020 election, it certainly wasn't good for Democrats. It far overestimated Democrats in most states. Some states didn't, right? We'll talk about some states and some districts even that underestimated, Joe Biden support. That'll be a good thing for Kamala Harris. But at standard, we remember that in 2020, we were shocked by some of those states because the polling errors didn't seem to correct themselves. What I do think, though, is fundamentally different about this election is that, one, we were back in a day and age where we aren't talking about COVID polling. We aren't talking about, all these different methodologies that were unique to the time that still missed the mark on Donald Trump. Many of these polling firms have also made intentional efforts over the past 6 years to change their methodology to try to estimate and capture in that silent Trump vote, which actually did a disservice to Republicans in 2022 when they applied the same methodology and thinking to the Republican base in 2022, assuming that there would be voters who get out and vote on issues like the economy, issues like immigration, that were unhappy with that of Joe Biden and were going to turn out in the midterms. And we ended up seeing those polls overestimate Republican support in 2022. But again, this video is about 2020, not 2022. So let's go ahead and really unpack some of these states. Now, what I first need us to do is look at some of these battleground states. So I'm going to open up all these new tabs here. Give me a second as I just go ahead and scroll through all the swing states, because they really do have averages here that do matter when it comes down to what the inaccuracies were in 2020. And, we're going to spend some time looking at that, but I think it's worthwhile, right, discussing and talking about states like Virginia, states like Ohio, that you don't really see people talk about much. The polling errors don't really need to extend beyond that point. We don't really have substantive data points outside of those. We're going to have to also independently include states like Colorado, which don't have any existing averages, besides two polls that show Kamala Harris tied together, roughly up, 12.5, 13 points across the state. We'll talk about that and what that means for the election. But for the majority of these states, there actually are substantive polling averages that we can go ahead and take a look and unpack and just see what the inaccuracies were in 2020 and what that would mean for 2024. And so to start off, we're going to take a look at some of the states that aren't as important for the cycle, but still have some polling errors that are worth discussing, and what that means for states like Virginia and Ohio that are pretty standard, again, going to vote for Trump in Ohio, going to vote for Harris in Virginia, but those margins really can make a difference, and so let's go ahead and just take a look at that. So in Virginia, in 2024, Kamala Harris holds a 7.5% advantage, but in 2020, Joe Biden was overestimated in support by roughly 2 points. So I just realized I didn't actually spend time characterizing all of the safe states. I'm not going to spend too much time doing it, but it's worthwhile because we need to do it just to take a look at the electoral map here in all its glory, filling out some of these Republican states. Let's go ahead and just get through it very quickly. Shout out to the fill feature tool. I think that's one of the best things that we have on YAPMS. Alaska doesn't get much survey data, but South Carolina is pulled there. Not much inaccuracies there from the 2020 race. So right here, Donald Trump. I would even say, because I know that Donald Trump was slightly overestimated or underestimated in South Carolina, I'd make that a safe Republican state. Alaska, didn't really see much data points out of those states. Overall, though, even based on the margin right now, Donald Trump's on average up maybe 6 points across Alaska. Not substantive enough for me to say Alaska is going to be a state that Donald Trump wins by a safe margin, even if the polling error is similar to that of 2020. Anyways, getting back to the point, there are some states here too that just simply weren't polled at length in 2020. Maine at large is going to go to Kamala Harris by a likely margin. Nebraska second's on here, Maine second's on here. So pretty much all the remaining states do have these data points. So a 7.5% margin reduced down to 5.5% still keeps Virginia as a likely blue state. So doesn't need to get lost too much on Democrats there, but definitely something that, we should keep in mind here, that Virginia would end up being one of the closer states of the cycle for Democrats, despite it being a state that, Hillary Clinton won in 2016, Joe Biden won by double digits in 2020. It narrowed down to 5.5%. In Ohio, this is actually really good news for Donald Trump here, about a 5-point underestimation in 2020 in the state of Ohio, meaning Ohio is further than being just an 8-point state. It's a 13-point state for Donald Trump over Kamala Harris. Now, in the state of New Mexico, this is a state that also saw some polling. There wasn't much substantive data out of New Mexico back in 2020, so we're going to actually have to take a look at that on our own, going back to the 2020 cycle, narrowing down to New Mexico. I promise you we're not going to have to do this for each one. Joe Biden ended up winning the state by roughly 10.1%, and so an 11.7% margin, narrowed down to 10.1%. You're going to see the state reduce ever so slightly. Not enough to make the state anything less than likely for the Democrats, but still quite close if you ask me. Moving over to Texas, this is a state Donald Trump currently leads in by 6.5%. Well, back in 2020, the overestimation for Democrats was roughly 5 points. That would make Texas still a likely Republican state, but an 11-point likely Republican state. Pretty substantial, if you ask me. In Minnesota, Kamala Harris leads by 6.1%. Back in 2020, we saw that it overestimated Biden's support by roughly 2. This would actually narrow down Minnesota to being a lean Democratic state. So that should actually be quite worrisome for Democrats, just given, where they are in the state right now. Obviously, the 2020 era probably isn't going to return in 2024, but assuming it does, Democrats are on track for a pretty substantial, loss across the nation, especially if Minnesota's narrowing down to be at this point. So looking at Minnesota, 211 electoral votes for Kamala Harris, Donald Trump 182. Let's continue. Let's take a look at Florida, for instance, which has Donald Trump up by 5.3%, already a likely state. Donald Trump in the state of Florida was underestimated by 6 points. That would make Florida an 11-point margin to victory, still less than in 2022, but still a very substantial margin for the former president. Would be massive for Republicans in the state of Florida. That brings Donald Trump to 212 electoral votes. Now, we can actually take a look at some of the outskirts states. Colorado, for instance, in the last election, we saw that it overestimated Donald Trump's support here. Joe Biden ended up doing about a point better than what the polls had predicted. Based on the data points right now, that would make it a likely Democratic state. In Nebraska, second, we saw a 3-point overestimation. So Nebraska right now holds roughly an 8-point lead for Kamala Harris. That's going to keep it as a likely Democratic victory. And Maine second district here actually saw an 11-point polling error. An 11-point polling error in 2020, which means this district goes from not only being a district the Democrats win by a lean margin based on the average here, Republicans rather, by a lean margin. They win it by nearly a safe margin. And based on some new data points we can hopefully get out of Maine sometime soon, that will actually expand that state into being potentially even a safe state category for Donald Trump, just based on what we know about the district. Because it's being very much counteracted by a University of New Hampshire poll that says Kamala Harris holds a 5-point lead in Maine second. She's going to lose the district by 6, 7, 8 points. And so it's much more realistic to keep in mind when you apply that 11-point margin of shift here, that it should be a safe Republican state, but ultimately it's not. So Donald Trump at 213, Kamala Harris at 222. Let's continue. Let's take a look at the state of New Hampshire, where in this cycle, New Hampshire, we can see, I don't know why I didn't pull up. Let me just go ahead and scroll over to New Hampshire. New Hampshire has Kamala Harris with a 7-point advantage across the state, 7-point advantage. But when it comes down to 2020, what we saw then was that it overestimated Republican support by roughly 4 points, meaning that New Hampshire would be a lean Democratic state, bringing Kamala Harris to 226, but nothing super substantial for the Democratic ticket, absolutely, and underperformance compared to what their expectations are. In Iowa, again, not many substantive data points out of the state right now, an average of roughly 5.5%, 6 points in favor of Donald Trump, a 7-point overestimation for Joe Biden support in Iowa in 2020. That would make this state absolutely a likely Republican state. So Iowa, Ohio, Florida, Texas, the map doesn't look too different than what we typically know, but New Hampshire and Minnesota should be worry signs. The margins, what we know here, should be pretty substantial for the Republican Party. And now it comes down to these really important battleground states, the 7 important ones, 93 toss-up electoral votes: Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. Now let's start off with Nevada. This is a state where on 538, the margin here actually was overestimating Joe Biden's support, but on Real Clear Politics and all the other sites, we're overestimating Donald Trump's support. So because we're using 538 just for the sake of consistency, because I made a video this morning using 538's margin, this is what we're going to do for this cycle. So Nevada, back in 2020, slightly overestimated Biden's support. Looking at it, it's a 2-point difference here. Nevada was Biden +5 in the polling average. The actual result was Biden +3. Looking at that, it's a 2-point shift based on where we are right now. Kamala Harris holds a 0.6% advantage. That becomes a Donald Trump state. So lean for the GOP. That leaves us 87 remaining toss-up electoral votes. Let's continue on. Arizona is a good state to look at. Back in 2020, the estimations here were that Biden was going to win it by 3.5%. He won it by 0.3%. So that's roughly a 3-point shift. What we know about Arizona right now is that Donald Trump's up 1.8%. That's a shift enough to make this state lean for the Republican Party. In fact, if we're looking at it just based on actual margin, if we just want to go ahead and take a look, I want to make sure that I'm doing this correctly because it actually could make a difference in the call here. No, actually. So it would make it a lean Republican state. But Donald Trump would be flipping Nevada, flipping Arizona, and we still have a few more states to continue on for. The next state I'd look at is the state of Georgia. This state right now gives Donald Trump a 1.9% advantage. Now, Georgia actually didn't see much of a difference here for Donald Trump's support. It just was an underestimation of roughly 1 point. It would still make it a 3-point state, not enough to be likely, but still boosts up Donald Trump to 252 electoral votes. The next state I'd look at is the state of North Carolina, which Donald Trump holds a 0.7% advantage in. North Carolina underestimated Trump's support by 3 points. That would make this a lean Republican state. Not tilt, but lean for the GOP, putting Donald Trump at 268 electoral votes. And so this is where things get really, bad for the Democratic Party, arguably. When they're looking at the data points across these 3 Rust Belt states, I'm going to call it right now, Kamala Harris wouldn't win any of them in this circumstance. And so when you're looking at that, that brings Donald Trump easily to the largest electoral victory that we have seen for a Republican in the 21st century, the largest we have seen dating all the way back to George H.W. Bush, which was a landslide over 480 electoral votes. And so this cycle really is going to throw a lot of people for a loop when it comes down to the battleground states, assuming that this 2020 error is standard for 2024, which is why so many people know that it's not, because 2022, in theory, should have been a similar way, and yet it absolutely was not, because the first election after the Dobbs decision, a lot more in people's minds, abortion is also this more omnipresent reason that voters are, voting away from Donald Trump. White women are moving away. It was 7 points for Trump in 2016, 7 points in 2020. 1 point for him in terms of an advantage over the plurality of the electorate, which is white women, which comprise up 36% of the electorate. There's a lot of reasons to believe these polls are not going to be missing the mark like they did in 2020, but assuming they did, really good results for the Republican Party. So Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Let's start off with Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had an error here of underestimating Donald Trump's support by roughly 3 points across the state. Kamala Harris only holds a lead of 0.3%. So that means it's a lean Republican state at best for Democrats, given this circumstance. Michigan is the next example, a state that Kamala Harris holds an advantage in of 0.6%. The overestimation for Democrats and Joe Biden was about 5 points. So this would put Michigan right at the cusp of being a likely Republican state. And if Donald Trump ever was to take that advantage point in Michigan in the polls, it would actually make Michigan a likely Republican state. So already at 302, just 4 electoral votes off of Donald Trump's first victory in 2016, which was 306, and we're likely going to see that even bigger with the state of Wisconsin thrown in. And the state of Wisconsin, which was a pretty massive error back in 2020, right now holds an advantage for Kamala Harris of 0.2%. It would be an error here of 7 points from 2020, making Wisconsin a likely red state. And so this is what our electoral map would look like. Assuming the polling map was wrong in comparison, the same way it was in 2020, we would end up with an electoral map, an electoral college victory for the former president of 312 electoral votes to Kamala Harris's 226. This is a massive blowout for Donald Trump. It's not a landslide, but it's a blowout. It's a very substantial victory, and it's a very good one given the time, given the election, given all these circumstances that Donald Trump has seen arisen. Arguably, right, this race should be a much better race for Republicans. If it was Nikki Haley at the top of the ticket, I'm sure the race would be looking a lot differently today. But regardless, though, Donald Trump has had some pretty low points in this cycle since Kamala Harris became the nominee, and things look a lot better for him today than they did a month ago and 2 months ago. And overall, the metric points, if you're using the 2020 error, are really strong for the former president. And so it would result in here a very similar map to that of 2016. Where Minnesota is close, New Hampshire is close, Democrats win Maine, they win they win some of these states, but they lose the Rust Belt. They win Virginia, they win Colorado, they win New Mexico, but they lose the Rust Belt. They lose the states that do make a difference. If Kamala Harris was to win these Rust Belt states, if we were just to provide that for just a moment, she would win the election. Very similar story that we remember being told to Hillary Clinton in the aftermath of the election. Had you just won those 3 states, it wouldn't matter what happened in North Carolina, it wouldn't matter what happened in Ohio or Iowa or Georgia or Florida or Texas or Arizona or Nevada. You would win the election. This time, not the same thing. It is the same thing on that point, but she still doesn't win those Rust Belt states. It'd be a pretty bad map for the Democratic Party, too. It'd set the standard that Donald Trump's style of campaigning and Republican Party is the winning style of campaigning and Republican Party. And it would do a lot of damage to the Democratic Party's morale, the Democratic Party's second, and arguably, too, potentially the Republican Party's odds at winning in the midterm election immediately after. But they'd rather have the White House in the midterms, and so that's what they'd get in this circumstance. So 312, 226, victory for Donald Trump, pretty substantial one, and one that cannot be ignored given the current state of the polls. Be a pretty good map here for the Republican Party at large, but nothing that is guaranteed given that the methodologies have changed and the way that these races have interacted with voters and the way that voters have interacted with the races. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.